Welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Acton Climate Coalition to provide background on the resolution that we're sponsoring for Acton Town Meeting, which is going to be on September 8th. That resolution is called Declaring a Climate Emergency, a Better Future Starting Now. My name is Jim Snyder-Grant, and I'll be your first presenter, along with Lee Kettleson and Sargam Noria. Our plan is to get through these slides quickly and leave plenty of time for discussion. So you can jot down any questions or put them in the chat, save them for later. That will help us all get through the presentation and have a good discussion afterwards. Here's what we're going to be covering. We're going to review the latest climate science. We're going to talk about what can be done to avert the worst of the impacts of global climate change. We're going to talk about what the resolution says, and we're going to talk about why it will help to pass a climate emergency resolution in Acton and what you can do. But first, go ahead and find that chat button if you're willing to type something about what motivates you to want to learn more and act on the climate emergency. We'd love to know. And to give you time to think about that, let me also mention that during the presentation, we mentioned some politicians and political parties. These are not endorsements of those politicians, parties, or programs. The reason to mention them is just to illustrate the sort of responses that have arisen in response to the climate emergency. And I see that no one, as far as I can tell, no one has typed anything in, so we'll just assume you're here for whatever fine reason you're here. The Acton Climate Coalition formed in late 2019. Oh, there we go. Let me just take a brief pause and thank Katie for noting that it's imperative that we act, and she needs a change from COVID and politics. Right on. The Acton Climate Coalition formed in 2019. We're focused now on passing the climate emergency resolution at the September 8th, 2020 special town meeting. Here, the steering committee member organizations, representatives from these groups are doing the day-to-day work of creating materials and doing outreach. The group now includes many additional endorsing organizations, including civic groups, faith communities, businesses, and our local state reps. And we now have 36 endorsing organizations, and we're happy to add more. We were inspired by more than 1,700 cities, towns, and countries around the world, representing over 830 million people that have passed climate emergency declarations. So now let's hear from Lee Kettleson.
Hello, everyone. First, we're going to do a quick review of why and how the climate is changing and the impacts of that on all of us. You may already know some of this information, but please think of how you can use it to convince other people. We would like to thank the Climate Reality Project for the use of some of their Truth in 10 presentation slides in this section. The sky is not a vast and limitless expanse, although it looks that way to us when we stand on the ground and look up. In reality, there is just a thin shell of atmosphere surrounding our planet. This is a photo from the International Space Station with the sun revealing the atmosphere in blue around part of the Earth. We are dumping 152 million tons of human-generated global warming pollution into the atmosphere every single day. That pollution, especially carbon dioxide, is building up and trapping heat. The basic science of global warming has been understood since the 1800s. Here's how the greenhouse effect works. Energy from the sun comes to the Earth in the form of light. That energy is absorbed by the Earth and warms it. Some of that energy is re-radiated from the Earth in the form of heat. Some of that outgoing heat is trapped by the atmosphere, which is a good thing. It has kept our planet at a stable temperature. Now, however, we have been thickening the blanket of our atmosphere by filling it with heat-trapping pollution. More heat energy is trapped, and that excess heat is warming our planet at an unprecedented rate. There are many sources of human-caused global warming pollution: industrial activities, power generation, agricultural practices, transportation, burning forests, and others. But the main source and cause of rising global temperatures is the burning of fossil fuels. The carbon emitted by the burning of fossil fuels has risen dramatically since 1950. All that burning of fossil fuels since the 1950s has caused a rapid concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to levels never seen before. As shown here on this graph of carbon dioxide levels over the last 800,000 years, rising and falling levels due to changing geological and astronomical conditions have been part of Earth's history for millions of years. But now, as you see at the right edge of the graph, carbon dioxide levels are the highest they've been in human history and likely the highest in 3 million years. Next to the impact on our temperatures. This video from NASA shows a five-year average temperature anomalies for different parts of the globe over time. A temperature anomaly is the difference between the long-term average temperature and the temperature that is actually occurring. Higher than normal temperatures are shown in red and lower than normal temperatures are shown in blue. In the first several decades right here, there's a mix of red and blue. It's only in the last 2 decades that global temperatures have risen dramatically as a result of this pollution trapped in the atmosphere. We are in uncharted territory. Average globally, the last 5 years from 2015 through 2019 have been the hottest 5 years on record. Next, we're about to explore the impacts of this on all of us and our world. These are very troubling, and that's why many people try to ignore this whole issue. But remember, we are also going to explore many hopeful signs and what you can do. By paying attention, you can be part of the solution. Not only are heat waves becoming a major public health issue, but heat stress is now depressing crop yields of staples like rice, corn, and soybeans. In addition, higher carbon dioxide levels are decreasing the nutrient content of wheat, rice, and soybeans. These climate impacts will increasingly affect food supply worldwide and may well lead to food shortages. Globally, more than 90% of the extra heat energy trapped by our atmosphere is going into the oceans. This excess heat makes ocean-based storms like hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones stronger and more destructive. This is a satellite image of Hurricane Florence, which produced record-breaking rainfall across portions of North and South Carolina in 2018. The excess heat also disrupts the whole water cycle. With higher temperatures, the amount of water vapor that evaporates from ocean surfaces increases. That water vapor is then carried over land masses, yielding bigger precipitation events. When the land can't absorb all the rain from such storms and downpours, the result is flooding and mudslides. Extreme precipitation events have produced more rain and become more common since the 1950s in many regions around the world, including much of the US. On the left is a supercell storm with a column of rain at its center, taken in Montana in July 2010. On the right is a storm off Boston and Nahant on June 26th of this year. Sometimes people wonder how global warming can be blamed for causing more precipitation and flooding and at the same time more drought. The extra heat trapped by rising levels of greenhouse gases actually leads to both. As the climate changes, precipitation patterns also change, leaving some places with less rainfall than before. Changing precipitation patterns can lead to drought and water shortages. One example is shown in this photo when southern Brazil suffered a devastating drought in 2015 and 16. These droughts are further increasing the dangers of food shortages. Higher temperatures also have a direct impact on the incidence and severity of wildfires. We have seen just in the past couple of years those monster wildfires in the western US and Australia, and now California just this week. In addition to damaging or destroying forests, killing animals, and wreaking havoc on ecosystems, these fires send more carbon into the atmosphere, some 8 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually for the past 20 years. Another impact of excess heat is one many of us are more familiar with, the problem of rising sea levels. There are two related causes. First, higher water and air temperatures are melting the glaciers. For example, the ice in Greenland is melting 9 times faster now than it was during the 1990s. Second, as water warms, it expands and sea levels rise. Billions of coastal residents could be displaced and billions of dollars of investment are at stake. The Massachusetts coast is very threatened. Warmer temperatures have an impact on the spread of tropical diseases, which are moving into what were previously more temperate zones like New England. Communities that have had the least benefits of fossil fuel use have long suffered the worst pollution and health damage. Shown here is the low-income community of West Port Arthur, Texas, surrounded by oil refineries. Now, the worst impacts from climate change itself are also falling on low-income communities of color and indigenous communities around the world. They are less protected than others from rising seas, heat waves, loss of farmland and food, and the spread of disease. We will not continue to detail all the impacts, but you can see a partial list here. In addition to being an emergency threat to human lives, the World Economic Forum says that climate change is the #1 threat to the global economy. Now I will turn it over to Sargam for the better news, the good news.
Thanks, Lee. Hi, everyone. My name is Sargam, and I'm going to be a senior in high school this coming September. I'm also a member of Sunrise Acton, and I'll elaborate on what that is later. So it's easy to feel anxious and overwhelmed by all of this, and it's important to acknowledge what a scary future climate change presents. But there is also a lot of reason to have hope. So here is the good news. We have the solutions at hand. The technologies that we need to use to end carbon emissions have already been developed. They have been dramatically improved, and they have been deployed around the world. We still have time to avert the worst impacts of climate change, but only if we start now and act fast. Wind energy alone could supply 40 times more electricity than the entire world currently uses. Production of wind energy around the world is growing rapidly. Every hour, the Earth receives as much energy from the sun as we would need to run the entire global economy for a year. If we can increase the fraction of this energy that we harvest and use, we can make a lot of progress towards solving the climate crisis and helping local economies at the same time. The amount of solar energy being installed worldwide has already shown dramatic growth. Just as we have seen with other technologies, such as computer chips and cell phones that become affordable when widely adopted, solar costs have also fallen dramatically. In some regions, solar energy is less than half the cost of electricity generated by burning coal. Battery storage is an essential part of the green energy revolution. Batteries allow us to store excess solar or wind energy and use it during those times when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Batteries are also critical for the electric vehicle market. All of these automobile manufacturers now offer electric vehicles or will soon. Electrifying the transportation sector and moving the electric power generation to renewable energy are critical aspects of eliminating carbon emissions. Progress towards this renewable future is already underway in Massachusetts, which is among national leaders on climate initiatives. There are roughly 117,000 jobs in the state's clean energy sector. Our state has been named the most energy efficient state for the past 9 years.
Oh.
Another very hopeful sign is that the American public is calling for action on climate change. In 2019, researchers found that a 73% majority of public opinion sees climate change as our most pressing national issue. This was, of course, pre-pandemic. In Massachusetts and in Middlesex County, support is even stronger. The exploding youth movement for emergency climate action is leading the way. School strikes are a prime example. Greta Thunberg, a Swedish teenager, began striking her school every Friday, going instead to the Swedish parliament to stand on the stairs and demand an emergency response on climate. Such school strikes have spread around the world. And now Greta has spoken at UN climate gatherings, at Davos, and at many other international meetings. Greta's fiercely truthful approach has proven enormously successful at mobilizing millions of people. The Extinction Rebellion is an international protest movement. Repeated protests have been held in nearly every country in the world.
For what?
There are several large youth-led organizations in the US calling for emergency action to save our climate. A prominent one is the Sunrise Movement. Its mission statement says, in part, Sunrise is a movement to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. We're building an army of young people to make climate change an urgent priority across America and the corrupting influence of fossil fuel executives on our politics and elect leaders who stand up for the health and well-being of all people. Acton Boxborough Regional High School has an active Sunrise Movement chapter. It's called Sunrise Acton, and I'm actually one of the leaders of it. What we do are organized meetings where we take collective action by calling or emailing legislators or attending climate strikes in Boston. We formed 1 year ago, so we are still fairly new. And in this picture that you see right now, her name is Varshini Prakash, and she is the executive director of Sunrise and a graduate of AB and UMass Amherst. As early as June 2019, candidate Joe Biden declared, "We are in a climate emergency, and we must take drastic action now to address it." So today, I'm announcing my plan for a clean energy revolution and environmental justice. And now here's Lee again.
Oh, I'm back. I'll give you some more bad news. Let's examine what makes the current situation an emergency and what we gain by declaring it an emergency. Dictionary definitions of emergency all reference a state that calls for immediate action. The Oxford English Dictionary declared climate emergency to be the word of 2019 and defined it as a situation in which urgent action is required to reduce or halt climate change and avoid potentially irreversible environmental damage resulting from it. Many people realized we were facing a climate emergency when the world's leading climate scientists assessed 30,000 scientific papers and issued a report in October 2018 that warned us, to avoid catastrophic environmental breakdown, we must keep global heating to 1.5 degrees centigrade. This is the cover of that report by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. As you may know, climate scientists and government policymakers set targets or limits for average global temperature rise, usually expressed in degrees centigrade. This IPCC report set a limit of keeping global mean temperature to an maximum increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade, which in Fahrenheit is 2.7 degrees. And they detailed both why that limit must be met and what must be done to reach it. The world is already currently at 1.1 degrees centigrade hotter than the pre-industrial average temperature. In Fahrenheit, we are now 1.8 degrees hotter than pre-industrial temperature. Here's how the co-chair of an IPCC working group described this report. It's a line in the sand, and what it says to our species that this is the moment and we must act now. This is the largest clarion bell from the science community, and I hope it mobilizes people and dents the mood of complacency. In addition to the 1.5 degree limit, the other key takeaway of the IPCC report is the speed at which we must reduce carbon emissions in order to stay under the 1.5 degree target. The IPCC reported that under current carbon emission levels, the 1.5 limit could be reached by 2030, in as few as 12 years from the date of the report in 2018. To have a chance to keep below 1.5 degrees, and they only gave that a 2/3 chance, the report said global carbon emissions must be cut in half by 2030. So now here we are in 2020. We only have 10 years to achieve that 50% global cut. So the emission cuts need to start now. A major risk of not acting quickly is triggering what are called tipping points. These are Earth systems that once sufficiently disrupted can reach a runaway point or point of no return. Examples include forest loss, soils overheating, ocean heating, and the melting of polar permafrost, which releases methane. Permafrost is already melting, and this is likely to be a very critical tipping point because methane produces 20 to 100 times the heat-creating effect in the atmosphere as compared to carbon dioxide. Most of these systems have already been damaged by current warming, and mounting scientific evidence documents that these impacts, such as the melting of ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, are proceeding far faster than recent climate models had predicted. No one can assure us that a particular degree of warming, like 1.5 degrees, will not cause any of these systems to reach the point of no return. This diagram here is by Job 1 for Humanity and shows that these tipping points also impact each other, often amplified and accelerated by feedback loops. The danger is that this can cause a cascade that becomes irreversible and that can no longer be stopped by reducing emissions, driving global heating uncontrollably higher. Many of these tipping points were not counted in the UN report that said that global carbon emissions must be cut by 50% by 2030. This means that faster emission cuts are really needed to improve our chances of avoiding the worst impacts. This drawing illustrates that when tipping points are triggered and interact with each other, it is predicted that, in addition to all the physical impacts, the result would bring economic collapse, social instability, and war and conflict over resources, including food and livable land. Avoiding these catastrophic risks is another reason that we need to bring down emissions as soon and as deeply as possible. To sum up, it is an emergency because people are already suffering badly. It is getting worse rapidly. The sooner we act, the better chance we have of avoiding the worst impacts. I get to tell a little of the good news. And acknowledging that it is an emergency can begin a climate mobilization. And we will describe how a climate mobilization can avoid the worst climate impacts and even create a better future worth fighting for. The organization Climate Mobilization is leading the effort to get governments to pass climate emergency declarations. Their founder and executive director, Margaret Klein Solomon, explains. Individuals and groups can respond to emergencies with reason, focus, dedication, and shocking success. Emergency mode is the mode of human psychological functioning that occurs when individuals or groups respond optimally to existential or moral emergencies. This mode of human functioning, markedly different than normal functioning, is characterized by an extreme focus of attention and resources on working productively to solve the emergency. The United States response to World War II in the 1940s is the best example here of emergency mode. Dr. Solomon says in her book, after years of stubborn isolationist denial of the threat and clinging to normal functioning as Germany swept through Europe, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor ended American isolationism and initiated the example par excellence of America in emergency mode, full-scale mobilization. The Climate Mobilization website notes that by entering emergency mode and mobilizing for total victory, the U.S. accomplished truly staggering feats. The country joined together with a spirit of unity, sacrifice, and common purpose. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Within months, new modes of government contracting and mass production had been developed so that by halfway into the first year of the war, the U.S. was outproducing its allies and adversaries combined. The public also mobilized. Young men sacrificed their lives fighting for their country. Women surged into factories to produce war material. Citizens invested available cash reserves in war bonds. We also made huge advances in the sciences. The first computer was invented, as were blood transfusion and radar technology. So the US has proven that it can undertake a massive mobilization and transformation. Therefore, we can accomplish an emergency mobilization to protect humanity from climate catastrophe. Many organizations and leaders call this needed mobilization the Green New Deal. Proponents describe it this way. Each Green New Deal project will invest in workers, businesses, communities, and hence our whole nation. It calls our whole society to participate in a grand national project, the rapid transition to a good society, a society of broad opportunity, equal occupational and political justice, productive prosperity, and environmental sustainability. As John Kerry explained recently in the Boston Globe, if the world reaches 100% renewable energy, it means more jobs in energy, not less. It's not a choice between economic recovery and climate action. Solving the climate crisis is the engine of our economic future. Now we'll return to Jim to talk about Acton. You're muted. Hey, Jim, you're muted.
Now I'm not muted, right?
Correct.
Okay. Thanks for sticking with this, everybody. I know there's ups and downs on this. This is a difficult journey, but I'm glad we're doing it together. So, as the Climate Mobilization Campaign explains, local governments are an important place to pilot strategies for doing this. And any climate emergency program passed by Congress will need to be implemented by cities and states. If they refuse, it gets derailed. Local campaigns are also a jumping off point for people to join national pushes around projects such as the Green New Deal, the climate strike, the climate emergency declaration in Congress, and other important legislation. In June 2018, Acton conducted a municipal vulnerability assessment that identified flooding, heat waves, severe storms with wind, snow, ice, and drought as the 4 climate hazards of greatest concern facing our community directly. The report also mentioned that risks of disruptions elsewhere and their impacts on Acton, such as food shortages and other material shortages. Speaking of heat waves, Boston now averages 11 days above 90 degrees every year, and by 2030, that figure will likely rise to between 20 and 40 days, and by 2070 could increase to 25 to 90 days. As we all know, severe storms can wreak havoc on our lives and our economy. In warmer temperatures, viruses incubate faster, and mosquito and tick breeding seasons are longer. Acton already suffers from high levels of tick-borne diseases, such as Lyme disease. Our region also already sees the occasional presence of mosquito-borne diseases, such as West Nile virus and Eastern equine encephalitis. So here are the reasons for Acton and the US to lead in rapid carbon reduction. First, developed countries and towns are responsible for more of the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions to date than the rest of the world, and so have a moral responsibility to lead. Here's a chart of cumulative CO2 emissions across the most polluting countries. The US is in the lead, followed closely by the countries of the European Union combined. Second, because of our greater resources, the more well-off countries, states, and towns are needed to demonstrate that technologies and financial, cultural, and political strategies can achieve sufficiently rapid transformation under varying conditions. Third, if we help lead in economic mobilization, Acton can grow our local clean energy industry, including jobs in solar energy, energy technology, research and development, energy efficiency, and installation of heat pump systems for heating and cooling. Pictured here is progress we've already made: solar installations in Acton at Gould's Plaza, the Acton Transfer Station, and Congregation Beth Elohim. Acton's been proactive in planning for climate action. The town commissioned an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions that came out in 2019. On this chart is one of many charts from that report, shows Acton's emissions from the stationary sector, which means electricity, heating, cooling, and hot water for buildings. The recent 2020 town meeting authorized a budget that includes funding for development of a climate action plan for townwide emissions reductions and a sustainability coordinator who would be working for the town manager. Passing a climate emergency declaration at town meeting will ensure that our town's planning will reflect a real mobilization that's ambitious and achieves the goals that we need to. Acton can join more than 1,700 other towns, cities, and countries that have passed a resolution and build the national and international call for an emergency mobilization. Boston, Worcester, and Amherst, as well as New York City and Los Angeles, are among the many US entities that have taken this step. So now let's step back and look at the actual proposed Acton resolution, what it says and what it would do if passed. First, there's an opening section of whereas clauses that cover some of the same facts that were presented in this forum. After all the whereas clauses, the resolution concludes with a series of resolve sections. Be it therefore resolved that the residents of the town of Acton hereby declare that a climate emergency threatens our town, state, and nation, as well as humanity broadly, and that mobilization to meet this challenge is both an imperative and an unprecedented opportunity to stabilize the climate, remedy environmental harms, create clean energy jobs, and improve human lives. Be it further resolved that the members of Acton Town Meeting call on town government and staff and all Acton civic groups, businesses, and residents to commit to a climate mobilization effort with appropriate support from the state and federal governments to bring net townwide carbon emissions to zero as quickly as possible with a target date of 2030. Be it further resolved that the town of Acton's climate mobilization should also accelerate adaptation and resilience strategies in preparation for intensifying local and global climate impacts. Protect trees, forests, and other open spaces because of their ability to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. And ensure that the costs of such mobilization efforts do not unfairly burden those who are economically or socially disadvantaged, and that the benefits of a realized sustainable future accrue to all. Be it further resolved that the town of Acton calls on state and federal elected officials to initiate a climate emergency mobilization and provide appropriate legislative, regulatory, and financial support to municipalities to implement local climate emergency initiatives. And that's key because we can't do it alone. The kinds of changes that we're going to need at an emergency level to get us from our current emissions levels down to a net zero are going to require significant support from both the state and federal levels. So many of us are used to thinking about climate change as something that's the result of our individual choices. And although we can make impact through those choices, like choosing not to fly or changing how we eat, we believe we will not resolve the emergency without a society-wide response. We need everyone to work together to help build the climate emergency movement. To begin our mobilization, everyone needs to help. I want you to think about the people you can invite to participate in this webinar. I'd like you to go to the actonclimatecoalition.org and sign that pledge that to either come to town meeting and vote for this resolution or other actions that will help with the passage and the implementation of a climate emergency. Talk with your family, neighbors, and friends about the climate emergency. Discuss how you feel and how they feel and what can be done. A lot of us feel isolated with our fears about this, and talking to others is how we can join together. And of course, join one or more of the member organizations in the Acton Climate Coalition to help achieve critical change. You can find a list of all those fine organizations at actonclimatecoalition.org.